Welcome to Rising Woman Leaders. I'm your host, Meredith Rom, and I believe the time has come for women to share their gifts, their voice, and their stories. I love seeing women spiritually and financially empowered, thriving in their life's work, and doing what they love every day. I've gathered a community of women living their dreams to tell us their stories and inspire us to step into more courage, self-love, and feminine leadership. If you like this podcast, follow me on Instagram at Rising Woman Leaders and sign up for email updates at risingwomanleaders.com. Now get cozy with a journal and a cup of tea. I hope you enjoy today's show. My intention with this podcast is to elevate women's voices, to awaken and inspire women rising on the path of feminine leadership. I believe it's incredibly healing when a woman is witnessed in sharing her story, and it's those stories that will uplift, encourage, and inspire us all. And as I'm sure you've received a lot from this podcast, I also know there may be some of you out there who are feeling like you'd like to go deeper, that you would love to get to know the other women listening, that you'd love to learn more from some of these guest teachers and from me. So for those of you that are feeling this desire to go deeper, I have an invitation for you today. I'm launching a 9-month feminine leadership initiation program called the Sovereign Circle. Sovereignty is all about stepping into our autonomy, our power, being boundless and free. And I also associate this word with the queen, someone who is devoted to the people she's here to serve, but also really knows how to take good care of herself and stand in her power. So we begin this February, and the program includes a monthly sisterhood call, a monthly guest teacher call, a one-on-one coaching session with me, as well as monthly wisdom teaching recordings over the 9 months. This will be the 3rd time I'm leading this program, and I have to say, these women really do get to know each other and develop strong bonds over time. Already, I have seen such beauty of these women supporting each other, and I'm so inspired to continue creating and offering this container for women who are seeking uplifting community, guidance, and support. We'll be moving through the chakras, starting with the root, all about home, self-love, body wellness. Then we'll move up to the sacral chakra, which is all about our feminine essence, creativity, sensuality, and the womb. Then the solar plexus, which is about money, self-worth, abundance, action, and willpower. We'll move into the heart chakra, which is about our joy, love, romance, relationships, sisterhood, and connection. Then the throat chakra, which is about service, leadership, our truth, authenticity. The third eye is intuition, spiritual essence, meditation, dreams, and visions. And the crown, connection to the divine. We'll close out the program with a closing ceremony to witness each other as stepping into life as our highest selves and stating our vows to our life and to the world. It's so powerful to be witnessed in speaking our truth and to have our beauty reflected back to us from other women. I'm telling you ladies about this first, and I just want you to keep it in mind because it's limited to 12 women and we begin on February 6th. I'll be leading a webinar on December 6th on the new moon called 2019 Fulfilled, where I'll be sharing how to map out the next year, the new year, following your intuitive feminine guidance. So if you're interested, head on over to risingwomanleaders.com to learn more. When you sign up on the page, I will send you the program guide and all the call dates and details. I'm here today with Nicole Rom. She has been the Executive Director of Climate Generation, a Will Steger legacy, since the organization was established in 2006. Prior to Climate Generation, she managed the education programs for the National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes office in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She's taught undergraduate and graduate level courses in environmental education and climate change at the University of Michigan and Hamline University. She was an environmental educator with the U.S. Peace Corps in the Republic of Kazakhstan for 2 years. She received her MS in Environmental Policy, Behavior, Education, and Communication from the School of Environment and Sustainability at University of Michigan. And Nicole was recognized in 2015 as a 40 under 40 clean energy leader by Midwest Energy News. She's passionate about the outdoors. She loves the lakes in Minnesota, cycling and skiing. And she's also my sister. Welcome, Nicole.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm honored to be featured on your Rising Women Leaders podcast.
Yeah. So climate change has really just been such a forefront issue in our day and age in this generation. And we can really start to see the effects of what's happening in our world right now. And I wanted to bring this to light on the podcast so people that may not know a lot about it to educate themselves, see what we can do. But what I first wanted to ask you, because we come from a long line of people who care about the environment. And I wonder if you want to just, and you live in Minnesota now where our grandmother lived and canoed in the Boundary Waters Wilderness. And I know that was a big gateway for both of us. And I wonder if you could just share about that, our family lineage, and how that helped you develop a love for the environment growing up.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great way to start because our personal connection to the natural world often starts as early as when you're a toddler or a baby, and it kind of grows over time. And we know from research that it's role models and it's significant life experiences, or sometimes even an environmental justice issue that affects our ability to engage in this as an environmental activist. And I feel very lucky. You and I are blessed to have grown up in a family that really values the natural landscape, wild lands, wildlife, and beautiful spaces through our mom, who's an artist and depicts it in her paintings, uses it as a focus point, through our father, who grew up, as you mentioned, the son of parents who started really actually one of the early canoe country outfitting businesses in northeastern Minnesota, where my grandfather was born and grew up. And our grandparents really had a strong love of place, the Boundary Waters, where they lived and resided, and felt a responsibility to protect it. And so our father and his siblings grew up learning about the challenges of having a beautiful public lands in their backyard and the importance of protecting it through a variety of means, including advocacy. Our dad even went to Washington, D.C. to advocate on behalf of making the Boundary Waters a wilderness area. And you and I are both proud descendants of the Rom family that were instrumental in creating this really special spot in northern Minnesota to be protected to be protected as wilderness, where humans can enter and canoe and enjoy it, but they can't remain. And so when I think about growing up, Minnesota was a consistent place that we came to every year to ski in the winter and to go on canoe trips in the summer. And so it became a very grounding place for me, and was part of the reason why I moved here 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I know those early experiences just shape so much of what can happen later. And so you went to the Peace Corps and decided to teach English, and also you brought in environment, ecology into that. And then later you decided to do environmental studies and then later focus on climate change. So I have more questions about climate change, but anything you want to share just about your Peace Corps experience or just living abroad and anything that you learned from that?
Well, a couple of things. First, I want to share that even though we grew up in a family that valued the outdoors and the environment and nature and protecting it, it wasn't until I was in high school and my parents sent me on an outward bound course in the Colorado Rocky Mountains that I realized that this was actually something that I loved on my own. It wasn't something that was being forced upon me by my parents anymore. Because I vividly remember in my teenage years taking like a Walkman, like an iPod back in the 80s in the woods when I would go on walks, and I was always annoyed that we had to go hiking. And that was a really pivotal moment. I was about to turn 16, and it became an opportunity where, in the support of my peer network, I realized this was something I really loved. And so when I got to college, I will never forget one of my first year seminars was called Literature and the Land. And it incorporated all of my favorite environmental authors, Terry Tempest Williams and Thoreau and Emerson and Ed Abbey. So people that, date back to the transcendental era all the way up to modern day. And I thought, I can actually major in something where I get to read and learn about the environment. This is amazing. And so post-college, I knew that I either wanted to pursue a career in nonprofit advocacy or teach, because I had a real love for kids and children and environmental education. So the Peace Corps felt like the nice opportunity for me to, live abroad at a time when you don't have a lot of cumbering restrictions on your life right after college, but also to decide if teaching really was something I wanted to pursue or not. And it was interesting being placed in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is the ninth largest country in the world. It was a former part of the Soviet Union, and it was the testing ground for a lot of the world's worst environmental disasters. It's where we tested our nuclear missiles. Semipalatinsk was a major site. One of the largest inland seas, the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan, actually dried up because they diverted the two rivers that fed into that lake to irrigate cotton. And that caused all sorts of public health implications and cancer among people in that population. So when I was first given the country, I thought, wow, first, where is it? And then second, well, let me learn about it. And when I realized, wow, what an opportunity to be able to teach environmental education in a country that has beautiful natural environments, from the mountains in the southern part to the steppe in the northern, but had this history of kind of environmental degradation, I thought, what an opportunity. And I was really lucky to be able to teach 5th through 11th graders and get them connected to the river and the mountains and the local natural park in their town. It was a wonderful experience, super rewarding, challenging. And at the end of it, I realized that I was not cut out to being a teacher, but that I felt strongly that for me, the environment was my focus, and education was a means to get the environmental outcomes we need and desire. And so for me, it became clear that my calling was more focused on the environment as the main piece and education as a vehicle, and not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. And that's so much of what you're doing today with Climate Generation.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what Climate Generation does, what the kind of mission and also like day-to-day kind of projects that you're working with?
Great. That's a great question. Well, first we start with a standpoint that climate change is the most urgent, significant issue that we need to deal with today, that we are the first generation. And I say by we are the first generation, I mean everyone alive today, not just millennials or young people or old people, but all of us. We are the first generation to see the impacts of climate change, and we are the generation that has the responsibility to address it. So we start from that place. We ground equity in our work, recognizing that low-income communities and communities of color are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and we have an inherent responsibility to protect them, to engage them in innovative solutions. We were established actually on the foundation of story. So we were started by a famous Minnesota National Geographic Arctic explorer named Will Steger, which is the tagline of our name, Climate Generation, a Will Steger legacy. And for those of you that have never heard of Will Steger, he's actually a really remarkable human being because he's accomplished a lot of firsts and lasts. And by that, I mean, he was the first person to go to the North Pole via dog sled in 1986, from Canada to the North Pole. Then 3 years later, he took the longest possible expedition across Antarctica, with an international team to raise worldwide attention to the protection of Antarctica for research and scientific understanding and not for mineral exploration. And it was through those expeditions that Will connected them to students and schools and classrooms and media around the world, to these places that were really far away. And it allowed him to reach a larger audience. And it was on these expeditions that Will traveled these incredible ice shelves that have now all disintegrated as a result of climate change. And Will's wake-up call was in the early 2000s when we were starting to see the impacts of climate change unravel in the Arctic regions, which is where we knew we would be seeing the impacts first. When he read that an ice shelf disintegrated off of Western Antarctica that took his team a month to dog sled across. It's one of the most grueling parts of his trips. It was very vivid in terms of his connection to that landscape. And so when he read that that ice shelf had disintegrated much sooner than scientists had realized, Will knew it was his responsibility to leave his home in northern Minnesota, move down to the Twin Cities, and establish an organization that was at that time with the Will Steger Foundation, but now Climate Generation, dedicated to education and action on climate change. And so when it comes to what we do, besides recognizing we're now all eyewitnesses, we don't just need Will Steger's powerful eyewitness story of his expeditions as a way to connect, whether you're a gardener or a birder, or you just like getting outside and you're seeing seasons change, you're seeing wildfires, you're seeing drought. I mean, I can get to a lot of the impacts, but I have no doubt that every single person actually has a climate story to share, whether it's natural in its focus or related to a person or concern for their child and the future that they're going to be growing up in, and what, species will be here or not. Whether you love winter like I do and you see a change to our seasons. So what we do on a daily basis, first and foremost, we support teachers. So classroom educators with curriculum on climate change and energy. We really are focused on building teachers' comfort and confidence to teach climate change in their classroom. And that work is national in its reach. We're proud that our Teacher Institute we hosted this last summer, we had over 21 states represented with teachers coming from all over the country. So support teachers. We also support high school youth to engage in activism and climate change solutions at their high school. So that could be getting in water bottle filling stations or solar on their roof, connecting them with public policy and meeting with decision makers. We work with communities to connect them to resources and to support their engagement in solutions and helping. We do a lot of work in communities where we're coaching people like you and I on how to tell your climate story, because we really believe that when you have that connection to something deep within you, that you can use that as a tool for action, whether it's a conversation with the media or a decision maker or your neighbor or your family member, that's where the action is going to change. And then last, we work with influential leaders, from business leaders to policymakers, to make climate action a priority in their sphere of influence. So we cut a lot of different audiences, but grounded in personal narrative and storytelling, and recognizing that we need to be solutions oriented. That climate change is often a daunting issue, but I have a ton of hope. I look forward to going to work every day. I get to work with an amazing team of 11 plus people that span the generations, who are all committed to this on a daily basis.
Yeah. I love the piece about the story and how, like, Will taking a month being on this ice shelf and then learning it's gone. Like, that is a pretty big, I can see that in my mind.
Yeah. And even for you and I, when I think about northern Minnesota, knowing that whole species of trees are going to migrate to Canada because they can't thrive in a warming climate. So our spruce trees and the pine trees that we love, that, define that place, just like in, California, for listeners that are there, Yosemite, you're seeing tree species that can't sustain where they are. Or in the Rocky Mountains, we're seeing that as well, where whole zones of plant life are migrating because the climate with which they're adapted cannot adapt.
Yes. Yeah. And can you give us a definition of climate change? And also, like, just in case there is anyone out there who's like, okay, can you break this down for me?
Sure.
And also why we shifted from calling it global warming to
Mm,
climate change.
that's a great question. All right. So I'll kind of answer this in two buckets. What do we know and how do we know it? So first, what do we know about climate change? First and foremost, we know that humans have had a noticeable footprint on climate change. And I'll back up and say um, where you get a lot of confusion is around the greenhouse effect, which is a natural phenomenon. But with the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the 1950s, we started in a geologic microsecond taking our fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and natural gas, from inside our Earth's core and started transmitting it into our atmosphere. And it's been known since probably the 1700s. Scientists have always known that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are warming gases, that they trap heat. So if you can picture the Earth with this thin layer around itself, or think of yourself, when you're cold in a room, you put on a sweater to trap heat. So essentially, we've put on a bunch of sweaters on the Earth and we're trapping all these greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's not getting released. And it's been compounded over time because when we started burning coal and oil and natural gas to fuel our cars, to fuel our homes, to fuel our airplane travel, we didn't know, the serious ramifications of it. And so what we need to do is actually take carbon out of our economy entirely. So what's called decarbonization. So removing carbon from all of our fuels to get all of our electricity from clean, renewable sources like wind and solar. And that future is actually a healthier future, a better future for our environment, for our children and future children. So hopefully that gets at what do we know? So we know humans have caused it with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, with the burning of fossil fuels. That the burning of fossil fuels is what is being trapped in our atmosphere. And we know it because we know that humans have had this indelible footprint because we've taken ice cores from Antarctica. So going back to Will Steger, actually, when he traveled on Antarctica, he had one of the famous Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scientists on that expedition collecting water samples and core samples. And they can actually look at the ice and snow that has fallen on Antarctica back hundreds of years, and they can without a doubt see the human footprint in the 1950s when we started, the advent of the automobile and all of our lifestyle changes radically shifted. You can see the exponential growth in temperature and carbon dioxide. And I'll also mention, in addition, when you hear greenhouse gases, methane is 20 times more dangerous than carbon dioxide. And methane is currently trapped in a lot of our permafrost in the northern part of our planet. So in Siberian Russia, in northern Canada, part of Alaska. And we're now seeing what's called a positive feedback loop where our permafrost is starting to thaw because we have warmer temperatures. And as the third permafrost thaws, it releases more methane, a more potent greenhouse gas that exacerbates climate change even more. That same feedback loop is happening in our oceans. Our oceans used to be a great storage sink for carbon dioxide. So we used to have all these places that carbon could be stored and managed, right? Like trees, our ocean. And now they're over capacity with how much they have to take in, that they're actually, like, our ocean is now not able to store as much carbon. And we're seeing in the Arctic, for instance, where we once had ice and a reflective surface half of the year, with less ice cover in the northern part of our globe, we're seeing increased melting of that ice, because when you have ice starts to melt, it reveals darker ocean. And when you have more darker ocean, it absorbs more heat, melts more ice. So we're seeing so many of these positive feedback loops around the globe. But we know humans are causing it from core samples in Antarctica. And we know that the culprit is our addiction to fossil fuels. And so the solutions require getting off of them.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help? Are there other?
Yes. And then the piece about the global warming.
Yeah. So my gut sense on why it changed, a couple of things. One, global warming explains the phenomena that is happening, but climate change is a better term, I think, because it explains that while, yes, the global temperature is increasing over time, the impacts are varied around the world. And so I think and partly I think why it shifted is we weren't getting the kind of momentum we needed politically on both sides of the spectrum, with it being framed around global warming. For conservatives and folks that are pulled to like the moral responsibility to protect God's creation, global warming is less of a term that resonates. Climate change speaks to the fact that we're seeing an increase in intensity and frequency of hurricanes and wildfires and droughts, that our climate is literally changing. And where global warming wasn't helpful, I think, as some people felt, well, if my winter's normal, then is global warming happening? And you can't look at one day or one season as a pattern. You have to look at it in the context over time. Mm-hmm. So climate change for me, in summary, just it is a more descriptive context to explain the impacts from global warming. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah, and it's hard to shift that addiction to fossil fuels, just what our whole society has been built upon, and lots of people make money off of that, and it's hard to shift into those new alternatives, which I know you are working hard for, and a lot of people are. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, if we don't start taking like big action on these things, if we are letting things continue as they are, like what is the world going to look like in 20, 30, 50, 100 years? Like what will we see in our lifetime? How will we be personally affected?
Right. That's a great question. Ooh, that requires deep breaths, because, when you really face the reality of what's already in the pipeline, for lack of a better metaphor, in terms of the emissions that we're currently releasing that we haven't actually seen, scientists know that we will probably lose our ice caps. So Greenland, the summer sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, huge parts of Western Antarctica by 2050 if we don't radically get off of fossil fuels. So an ice-free polar region means that we're messing with the entire temperature balance of the planet when you don't have those, parts of the globe reflecting that energy back into the atmosphere. We're going to see a loss of a lot of species. I think it's over 80%. This is by 2050 or 2100. I mean, those are the dire situations if we continue on a business as usual approach. The recent IPCC, so the world's leading body of climate scientists, just came out with a very important report just a few weeks ago that said the world literally has 12 years to get it right. And if not, we're going to see huge amounts of refugees and displacement and global unrest, really from, droughts and wildfire and, lack of food. I mean, everything is interconnected. That's like number one law of ecology. We're all interconnected. When you pull out one thing, you find it connected to everything else. So this IPCC report came with a loud alarm that said we need to keep our temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is a couple of degrees Fahrenheit. So radical shift, and that we need to do it drastically in the next 12 years. So even though I've painted a very dismal picture for what happens in 2050 and 2100, I want to spend more time painting the picture of a future that is so much more exciting. And I already feel like it's happening. It's a future where, You are able to get around in an electric vehicle with charging stations that are ubiquitous. It's getting on an airplane that is using cellulosic fuel. It's having your home heated by renewable energy, whether it's on your home or you're purchasing a community solar garden, where we're breathing in cleaner air, we're eating better food, we're more connected with community. We really believe that the solutions in this clean energy economy we're going to pivot to is going to be one that'll, lift us out of a lot of different ailments. So even though the 12-year window is dire, I want to also communicate strongly that I believe in what's called radical resilient hope. When the election happened 2 years ago and we saw science not being respected, climate change no longer being considered in policy decisions, it was easy to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to put my head in the sand and give up. And that is not what we need. And luckily, we've seen people really rise up over the last few years saying this is not okay. And that's really critical. I think the worst thing we could do is be apathetic, to give up, to say it's too big, it's too daunting. And the most important message I would leave any of your viewers is that your individual actions matter, but what you do in collective community is so much more greater, because we know the problem is huge in scale and requires scalable, huge solutions that are at the policy level, that's in private sector leadership, that's leadership at the state level, at the city level, in our homes, in our place of worship, in our schools. But it's what you do in community of others that is really, really important. It's also a space where you can talk about the grief. I mean, climate grief is really real. Actually, at our annual staff retreat, we take time to acknowledge the loss because it's really heavy. And it's important to do that and have gratitude. And we need to both do that, but at the same time, we can't wallow in it. We need to be focused on what we can do in the community of others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was just how do you stay hopeful in these times? Like, for anyone who is really feeling that grief or hopelessness, what do you suggest? Anything that would just help come back into that state of like, this is happening. We got this.
Yeah, I think what keeps me hopeful is when I look to leadership, not nationally, but leadership where it shows up. And there's so many examples of that. And I'll give some examples. I was in California recently for the Global Climate Action Summit that Governor Jerry Brown hosted with celebrities and leaders from around the world and around the US. And they, at that conference, galvanized significant private philanthropy and private sector investment in a clean energy economy. And, when you see the amount of money, even though it may feel like the fossil fuel lobby and interests have more resources at their disposal, I really feel like when we're seeing private sector companies with a vested interest in profits taking this seriously and building it into their business model and taking, looking at getting 100% renewable energy or becoming completely carbon neutral, those are huge models of leadership. And for me, I mean, just seeing the number of states and cities that have committed to 100% renewable energy, to see, private, to see universities, to see communities stand up, those are the pieces that get me going every day. And then within my work, we do so much mentorship of young people. And when I see a high school students showing up at a Capitol saying, I should be studying for a test, but I'm here right now because I'm concerned about the children that I have yet to birth. I'm concerned about the future I'm going to inherit. I mean, it's those moments that are almost like gut wrenching because you're like, thank you for being here. And you're right, you shouldn't be here. But it's those moments where I'm reminded this is why we're here. It's the impact you have, one individual at a time and then through collective action.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. So what are some daily actions and also bigger scale things that we can do to help?
Oh, I think I will, even though the timing may or may not be with the elections, I will always say that voting and voting issues that are a priority to you, for me, climate is my number one issue. And so I only elect candidates that commit to making that a priority and commit to addressing it. So voting is an extremely important and powerful personal action that you can take every 2 years. And it's so important that you do that. And I believe that, so nationally, our power sector, so how we produce and use energy, is still the dominant use of our carbon emissions. The second is transportation, so cars and buses. And the third is agriculture. So if you think about those big three scales, when you think about your individual, okay, have you looked at your utility to see if they offer wind or solar that you can pay a few extra dollars per month on your bill to say that you value and you want to see more of that? That's an important piece that you can do that sends a signal to your utility that this is the direction that they need to go. Transportation, can you bike, walk? Can you carpool? Can you invest in an electric vehicle? And those are going to be dropping even more, just like we're seeing the prices of solar are becoming more affordable. Agriculture, the IPCC report recently really talked about emissions from the agriculture sector. And as somebody that's been a meat eater my whole life, I'm definitely starting to think about maybe it's time I turn vegetarian for my environmental ethic, for the fact that, when it comes to carbon emissions, cattle have a huge responsibility and our agricultural system. So I think that, where possible, whether it's going meatless once a week, a few times a week, or entirely, whether it's eliminating just beef and cow out of your diet, whether that's dairy and beef is another. I have stopped flying where I have to do multiple flights. So if I'm traveling to visit you, for instance, and it's going to send me through Denver on my way to San Francisco, I won't book that flight because there's so many emissions that come in the takeoff and landing that when I choose to fly, I will spend the extra money to get there in one journey because I believe that's part of the commitment. Having a conversation with your neighbor, with your friend, with your family member. One of the most important things we could do is normalizing the conversation on climate change. I know so many of us are scared. You feel like you need to know the science. Maybe you heard what I said about explaining how this all works and you're like, I can't remember that. Don't worry about it. You don't need to be solid on the science or understand. All you have to say is, I'm worried about this. This is what I know I'm seeing, or this is who's going to be impacted. And it's from that place that you can connect with somebody heart to heart and get out of the divisiveness that might be there if you were to otherwise start with facts and figures, which is not going to change anyone. So normalizing the conversation, we should all be talking about it. We should, I feel strongly that if more of us were comfortable and having these conversations, then the behaviors and the action we take would also be more regular and routine. Yeah, what else would I say? In addition to voting, I think we all have a responsibility to let our decision makers know. We have a lot of power with how we spend our money, with our buying decisions, with who are our elected officials. So not being afraid to let those folks know how you feel, whether it's companies that aren't sourcing materials in a way that you would like, or a decision maker who didn't vote the right way on a policy proposal. Those are all important. Those are some examples of things that you can do. The most important is to not give up, to have a message that the solutions are there. It honestly comes down to political will. And everything that we're doing with normalizing the conversation is about building public will, public demand, so that our decision makers have no choice but to follow what we're desiring. And that's where we're going to get the major changes, is at that point. But in the meantime, we're going to do our work locally and in our sphere of influence and in our states and in our regions, because that's where we can get the action right now.
Yes. Thank you. Those are really powerful, empowering examples of what we can do. Uh,
Good.
I love to hear if you recommend any other resources. Like I know I love the movies, Chasing Ice,
Oh
Chasing
yeah,
Coral, anything like that that you recommend, either like movies, websites, books,
great.
things that we can just keep educating ourselves.
Yeah. Well, if you're a teacher or a parent of a high school student, I would encourage you to first and foremost visit climategen.org because we have a lot of resources. And even if you're not a teacher or a young person, a lot of our curriculum or lesson plans or information might just provide the context that you need. We also have a storytelling collection of hundreds of people who are sharing how they're either feeling the impacts of climate change or engaging in solutions. Just reading some of those is super empowering. I love, now not thinking about climate change, I love the website Skeptical Science. It was started by a scientist, I think in Australia or New Zealand, and it takes all the common climate denier myths, like, you know, is it the sun, or can geoengineering save us? And it debunks it and links it to peer-reviewed science articles. So, Skeptical Science, it's really easy and accessible. In terms of movies, I totally agree. What was powerful about Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral is their eyewitness perspectives, their first person narrative. And I think that's one of the most compelling ways we can connect people on the issue. An Inconvenient Sequel, which is the follow-up to Al Gore's first movie, is very good in that it focuses on clean energy. Jamie Redford has a new movie out called Happening, a Clean Energy Revolution that talks about how we're already in the midst of these changes. So films are great. And then books. I love everything from, fiction. Barbara Kingsolver is one of my favorite authors, and she wrote a book, Flight Behavior, that weaves in climate change, even though it's a work of fiction. One of my favorite books is Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone. It's weaves in psychology and mindfulness and gratitude into a book that acknowledges climate grief, but also helps inspire us to think about ways we can take action. And I'll just share from this book because I was looking at it to prepare for our conversation today. And I love some of the exercises they have in here around journaling. And one of them is journaling. When I imagine the world we'll leave our children, it looks like ... And that can both be acknowledging the grief, your question around what will it look like, as well as what's the hopeful vision. Or one of my worst fears about the future is ... Or the feelings about this that I carry around with me are. Some ways I can use it. So just really helpful tips for those of you that are feeling really overwhelmed and just need a pick-me-up. That's been one of my go-tos. Let me think if there are any other resources. Besides Skeptical Science. Drawdown, the book by Paul Hawken, talks about the biggest solutions we can take to address climate change. And one of them is going vegetarian. Another big solution he's a proponent of is educating women globally, because we know when we educate and empower women, there's all sorts of societal benefits that come from that. And that is one of the ways that we can globally address climate change. So Drawdown is a really wonderful, accessible book as well.
Great. Thank you. And anything else that's like coming up with climate generation, anything you're excited about, just what's happening now, anything else we can do to stay involved?
Yeah. Well, every year we send a delegation of individuals to the International Climate Conference. And this year it's in Poland, in Katowice, in December. And we're sending 4 business leaders from companies, so sustainability leaders, to have them experience it and translate that back here for the US. And part of our goal with sending business leaders is to tell the world community that in the absence of US leadership, we're seeing it at states and in the private sector. And we felt that was an important message. So if you're interested in following the negotiations, these delegates' blogs will be happening for the first 2 weeks of December. So that's an opportunity to look for. I would say, just gathering some of the curriculum resources. We're Super excited. Next year, we're launching our first ever humanities curriculum. So helping teachers connect climate change to English, social studies, language arts, foreign languages. So not just science and math, but more civics and other subject areas. And we're going to be hosting a big teacher training in Washington, D.C. next August, focused on the humanities. So if you know of teachers that are looking, that's going to be an exciting new opportunity for us next year. Those are just a few.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And well, thank you so much for just everything that's been shared today. So many resources, so many actions we can take. Before we close, I'll just end with a short prayer, but I wonder if you have any closing words or final takeaways that you want to leave us with.
I'm going to read a quote from Active Hope, Joanna Macy's book, because this frame, I think, really speaks to what's needed. So this is where we begin. By acknowledging that our times confront us with the realities that are painful to face, difficult to take in, and confusing to live with. Our approach is to see this as the starting point of an amazing journey that strengthens us and deepens our aliveness. The purpose of this journey is to find, offer, and receive the gift of active hope. And it just says that whatever situation we face, we can choose our response. And so I think our response needs to be active hope.
Thank you. Let's take a moment to just close our eyes and to breathe that in and receive. And tuning into our heart and just taking any wisdom that was shared today into the heart space with you as you go out into your day and into your week. Thinking of any personal intentions you want to make, any actions that you feel would be helpful in your life, in your community, and calling upon that place of hope within yourself, within your heart. Knowing that there is so much we can do when we act from that place of hopefulness. So I'll bring my hands to my heart and bow with gratitude. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for sharing with us. And thank you to everyone listening. Such an honor to have you here. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to our show today. We would love to hear what you think. Take a moment to hop on over to iTunes and leave us a review. We'd be so grateful to receive it. Until next time, namaste.